May 27, 1940. France is collapsing. The entire British Army, over 300,000 soldiers, is trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk, surrounded by German forces. Belgium has surrendered. The war is 9 months old, and inside a secret war cabinet meeting in London, Britain's most senior leaders are doing something that has been scrubbed from most history books. They are voting on whether to negotiate peace with Adolf Hitler. The Foreign Secretary, Lord Halifax, has just told the cabinet that through Mussolini, they might be able to get reasonable terms, that Britain could keep its independence, keep its navy, keep its empire, if they just agreed to sit down and talk. Most of the cabinet is listening. Most of the cabinet is considering it. And then one man stands up. He is 65 years old. He has been in power for exactly 17 days. Most of his own colleagues think he is a reckless, unstable drunk who should never have been given the job. And he says two words that change the course of human history. Absolutely not. That man is Winston Churchill. And what Hitler understood, what his generals understood, is that no army, no air force, no invasion fleet in the world was as dangerous as that one man's refusal to quit. Today we are telling the real story of the most fascinating psychological duel in the history of warfare, the battle between Adolf Hitler and Winston Churchill, not on a battlefield, not with tanks and bombs, with words, with will, with the terrifying power of one man who simply would not bend. Most people know Churchill as the cigar, the V sign, and the famous speeches. But the real Churchill, the one who kept the entire Western world from falling into darkness, is far more complicated, far more flawed, and far more extraordinary than the statue version. This is that story. To understand why Churchill's refusal was so extraordinary, you first have to understand how broken he was before he ever became Prime Minister. By 1939, Winston Churchill was considered a political disaster. He had championed the catastrophic Gallipoli campaign in World War I, a naval operation in 1915 that resulted in over 180,000 Allied casualties and forced him to resign as First Lord of the Admiralty in disgrace. He reportedly told a friend afterward, "I'm finished. I'm done." He sank into what he himself called his black dog, his term for the deep, consuming depression that stalked him throughout his life. He came back, but just barely. Through the 1930s, Churchill spent a decade in the political wilderness, dismissed from the front benches of government, widely mocked as a warmongering relic of a past era. Every week he stood in the House of Commons and warned that Hitler was rearming at a terrifying pace, that appeasement would not work, that Europe was walking toward catastrophe. Nobody listened. He ran up enormous debts. He nearly went bankrupt. He drank heavily. He painted obsessively, a habit he had taken up precisely to survive his depression. And he kept warning. Then, in September 1939, Hitler invaded Poland, and everything Churchill had predicted for a decade came true. Neville Chamberlain's government, humiliated and exposed, had no choice but to bring Churchill back. And on May 10, 1940, the same day Germany launched its devastating offensive across Western Europe, Winston Churchill became Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. He was 65 years old. He had been waiting his entire life for this moment, and the world was already burning. Here is what the movies never show you. When Churchill became Prime Minister, he did not walk into power surrounded by supporters. He walked into a room full of people who thought he was the wrong choice. Lord Halifax, his foreign secretary, a calm, aristocratic diplomat, had been the favorite to become Prime Minister. He had declined, but he was still in the cabinet, still powerful, and still deeply convinced that Britain needed to find a way to negotiate its way out of the war. On May 26th, 27th, and 28th, 1940, with Dunkirk unfolding in real time, Halifax pushed the war cabinet to approach Mussolini as a mediator. The idea was simple: use the still neutral Italy to broker terms with Hitler, preserve Britain's independence, its navy, its empire, It was not a cowardly idea. It was, in the brutal logic of May 1940, arguably the rational one. France was falling. America was not yet in the war. The British Army was stranded on a beach. But Churchill saw something Halifax did not. He knew that the moment Britain opened negotiations, the moment it showed any sign of wavering, the psychological war would be lost forever. Hitler would know that Britain could be broken, and a Britain that could be broken would never be safe again, no matter what terms were agreed. Churchill went around his own cabinet ministers one by one. He told them, nations which went down fighting rose again. Those that surrendered tamely were finished. He told them the chances of Hitler offering decent terms were 1,000 to 1 against. By May 28th, he had carried the cabinet. The vote was no negotiations. It was the single most consequential political decision of the 20th century. And it happened in a room most people have never heard of. With no cameras, no crowds, and no certainty it was the right call. What happened next is where Churchill became truly dangerous. Hitler's strategy in the summer of 1940 had two parts. First, defeat Britain militarily through the Luftwaffe. Second, and more importantly, convince the British public and government that resistance was hopeless, so they would force Churchill out and negotiate. Hitler actually believed the second part was more likely to work than the first. He was wrong, because Churchill understood the battlefield Hitler was fighting on, and he turned it against him. On June 4th, 1940, Churchill stood in Parliament and delivered one of the most famous speeches in human history. Not because it was eloquent, because it was a direct psychological message aimed at one man in Berlin. He told Parliament, and through the BBC, the entire world, that Britain would defend its island whatever the cost may be, that it would fight on the beaches, on the landing grounds, in the fields, in the streets, in the hills, that it would never surrender. Hitler and his propaganda chief Goebbels monitored every word of every Churchill speech. They knew the words. They understood their purpose. And according to researcher and historian Andrew Roberts, those speeches made Hitler increasingly hesitant about Operation Sea Lion, his plan for the invasion of Britain. On July 19th, Hitler gave a major speech in the Reichstag offering what he called the hand of peace to Britain. He was not being generous. He was testing Churchill, probing for any sign of weakness or willingness to deal. Churchill's government rejected it within the hour, not after deliberation, not with a formal diplomatic note. They had the BBC announce the rejection on the radio before Hitler had even finished his speech. That rejection, that instant, contemptuous dismissal, told Hitler everything. There would be no negotiated peace. Britain under Churchill would fight until the end. On September 17, 1940, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. He never rescheduled it. Britain had survived not because of superior numbers or firepower, but because one man had made it psychologically impossible for Hitler to believe victory was achievable. Here is the part that gets left out of every Churchill biography aimed at children. Churchill was not unbreakable because he was fearless. He was unbreakable because he had already been broken multiple times and had always come back. Gallipoli had destroyed his career and nearly destroyed his mind. The wilderness years had taken his money, his relevance, his reputation. The black dog had shadowed him since youth. He drank too much, worked his staff into exhaustion, made enemies of almost everyone around him. His own wife Clementine once wrote him a letter, warning that his sarcastic and overbearing manner was turning his colleagues against him, that he risked becoming actively disliked by the people he needed most. She asked him to take the warning in the spirit in which it was given. It was given in love, and it was absolutely right. But here is what all of that failure and pain had built inside Churchill by the time he reached 1940. An absolute, unshakable certainty that he had survived worse than this. That darkness was not permanent. That the worst moments in a person's life, or a nation's life, are not the end of the story. He had painted through his depression. He had written through his debt. He had lectured through his irrelevance. And now, at 65, with the world on fire, he had exactly the set of psychological scar tissue that the moment required. A man without Churchill's failures could never have delivered Churchill's courage. The darkness he had already lived through made the darkness of 1940 survivable. After the war, Hitler was dead. His 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12. Churchill was voted out of office by the British public before the war was even officially over. A rejection that devastated him, plunging him back into the black dog one final time. He called it the most ungrateful act in British political history. He came back from that too. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1953. He served as Prime Minister again. He lived to 90. But here is what history remembers most clearly. In the summer of 1940, when every rational calculation said Britain should negotiate, when Hitler's armies stood undefeated across the Channel, when Churchill's own cabinet was wavering, one man looked at the abyss and refused to blink. Not because he was certain of victory. He privately admitted the odds were terrible. But because he understood something that Hitler, with all his armies and all his power, could never grasp. That some things, freedom, dignity, the right not to be ruled by monsters, are worth fighting for, even when the fight looks hopeless. And that is why Hitler feared Churchill more than any army on earth. You cannot bomb a principle. You cannot invade a refusal. You cannot defeat a man who has already decided that defeat is unacceptable. If this story hit you, subscribe and leave a comment below. Do you think Britain would have made peace with Hitler without Churchill? See you in the next one.